We're just going to do the whole presentation like this?
That's fine with me.
So as Dr. O said, I'm here to tell you a little bit about Chicago Union Station and some of the great plans that we have in store for the folks using the station. So let's start out with a show of hands. Who has been to Chicago Union Station? Not everybody, but a good portion of the people in the room. So Chicago Union Station is the intermodal transportation hub of the Midwest. It's the third busiest station in the US, and certainly the busiest station outside of the Northeast Corridor. It serves more than 300 trains per weekday and about 150,000 people per day. So that's more than Midway Airport in Chicago, for example. It was built about 100 years ago. It opened in 1925, designed by the famous Daniel Burnham. It replaced another station that had been on that site. It took them 10 years to build the station. It was a very complex undertaking. Basically 2 structures, a head house and a concourse building, a whole network of streets and viaducts and bridges to cross over the tracks. Very complicated. But now the station is 100 years old. There are serious issues, capacity issues. It was really built more for about 50,000 people a day rather than 150,000 people a day. So we've got capacity problems. A lot of the station is very cramped. Unfortunately, one of the original buildings got demolished similar to Penn Station. That's the concourse building, and it got replaced by an underground rat maze, basically, that they then built a high-rise office tower on top of. And so it's dark, it's narrow, it's hard to get around. Again, also a capacity issue. We have some connectivity issues to the CTA, elevated lines and subways. We also have some safety and circulation issues. So this is not exactly the everyday view of Union Station. This happens to be the once in a generation, but actually once in arguably 3 generations, World Series win of the Chicago Cubs. So that certainly the busiest day at Union Station in recent history. I don't know if it was the busiest day ever, but still 150,000 people a day is a lot of people, and that's today. We project for Metra, our commuter rail operator, and their passengers account for about 91% of the passengers at my station. They anticipate about not quite a doubling of passengers by 2060. Amtrak expects about a doubling of passengers by 2060 at current growth. And honestly, there are some plans out there. Recently, the FRA completed a Midwest rail study that involved significantly increased service on, for example, a lot of the Michigan lines. Michigan has great train service now. The state is investing, Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, that projected even more growth than this. So what have we been doing about it? Well, back in 2012, the city of Chicago implemented a master plan for Union Station to address a lot of the issues that I was talking about before. That master plan was conducted by the city, but included Metra, the commuter rail operator, as well as Amtrak, the owner of the station, as well as other local and regional agencies. And so after that was done, a few years go by, and then we went into sort of the second phase of that master plan, basically taking that master plan, trying to flesh out the details, put a little meat on the bones, and get some of those concepts up to 15 or 30% design. We call it phase 1A, and that's just nomenclature. It's not important, but basically that's what we were doing with this next stage. And so the master plan and then this phase 1A, basically we looked at 14 key projects really at the station. And so let's start with projects that are within the actual building. The building is kind of in the middle here. It's the area that's shaded in white. in this slide. And those projects in red basically indicate concourse-related projects. The historic head house, by the way, is on the left. The concourse, that's the building that I said got demolished and then rebuilt. So this is kind of our problem area over here. It's also where all the trains actually come in. It's sort of the track level area of the state, excuse me, of the station. And so we focus there on really just blowing that area up, just opening it up, opening that concourse, getting rid of all the narrow passageways, and then also focusing on vertical circulation. Right now, our vertical circulation is highly overtaxed, especially during the peak period. And so we're looking at adding additional escalators and adding express escalators. Right now, there's a floor called the mezzanine between the street level and the track level. And so anybody coming down from the loop, the main business district, basically they have to take 2 sets of escalators to get down to track level. And so this project proposes adding express escalators to get more people up and out. Also more elevators to add capacity that way. We definitely have some work to do on the ADA side of things at the station, and so we're trying to add in elevators wherever we can. In particular, the S4 project over there is on the west side of Canal Street in the historic head house. Currently, there is no direct ADA access to the head house. The head house is where the Metropolitan Lounge is at. The head house is where ticketing is at. It's our main waiting area. It's where we queue for most of the Amtrak trains currently, but there's actually no direct ADA access. If you need to take an elevator, you have to come in, you have to find it first, good luck, on this side, and then go underneath the street and cross over to the other side to get over there. So basically, those are kinds of the kinds of things that we are focusing on within the concourse. Now, if we look out onto the train sheds, we have both a north and south train shed. We're a double stub end station, the only one in the United States, maybe the only one in the world, I'm not sure. But it's one of those things that helped to sort of cement Chicago as the transportation hub of the United States, because all trains had to stop here. There were no through trains, and you had to transfer in Chicago. And so that's kind of the setup that we have. I'm not arguing with that, but so that's our setup here. And we have, again, a lot of capacity issues on these platforms. I mean, we do have nearly 30 tracks, so we have a lot of tracks, but still, during the peak period, particularly from the south, we are really over capacity. And it's not just the number of tracks, but it's also the platforms themselves. So let's start out, say, with these couple of platforms over here. So we call these projects the P1 and P2 projects. These platforms are used entirely by our commuter rail provider, Metra. In one particular line, the BNSF operated line, which goes into the western suburbs, which have been the largest growing part of our suburban area. So those trains during the peak period run more on a heavy rail schedule than a commuter rail schedule. If you look at those schedules, you've got trains arriving in the morning roughly every 4 to 5 minutes on those tracks. And those are double-decker 10 to 11 car trains. And so each one of those trains can be carrying 1,300 people in one train. And you can have 2 trains theoretically pulling up to the same platform at the same time, one on either side. Now, these platforms were built in 1925. They're narrow, they have columns down the middle, they're not ADA compliant, and they have one way in and one way out, which is through the station. So imagine you have 2,600, nearly 3,000 people dumping out of trains onto this narrow platform. That's not a safe situation, right? It's not a safe situation. If there were ever an emergency event, like I said, one way in, one way out, I wouldn't want to imagine what would happen in that situation. But it's also a capacity problem. it takes a long time to unload that many people down a narrow platform with one exit. So what we're looking at doing is really doubling the width of several of these platforms, the busiest platforms. And that helps us in a variety of ways, right? It means that now everybody isn't as crammed onto that platform. It means it's ADA accessible. People can get around the columns without having to go onto the tactile edge. It means we can unload those trains faster. It also means we can turn around trains faster. So it increases our train capacity as well, because now the trains aren't sitting there nearly as long. And the other thing that we're able to do with that is we now have enough width to be able to put additional access points down to the platform from street level. Whereas now there's no way that we could fit that in. You can actually, with a wider platform, you can put stairs, escalators, and elevators at points down the platform to allow additional access points. And at the very least, to allow emergency egress, if nothing else. So a common question we get is, that sounds great, but hey, we've been to Union Station and there's not really any space to widen platforms. How are you going to do that? Well, when the station was built, it was built primarily for intercity rail service. And one of the ingenious things that they did is they separated the passenger platforms from all the back of house and cleaning and baggage platforms. So you actually have on every track, you have on one side passenger platform, on the other side a baggage platform. We still use those baggage platforms where the Amtrak trains come in. We do not use them for commuter rail trains, obviously. And so on those tracks, those platforms are just wasted space. And so we remove, or will remove, those baggage platforms and then move the tracks over, widen the platforms, and get all that extra capacity I was talking about. Another platform I want to talk about over here is something called the mail platform. And this one is really a linchpin in all of this, particularly for any of the projects here in the South train shed. And I'll show you this. These are some pictures of it. It's called the mail platform because basically since 1925, actually since before 1925, it has been the main way of getting mail from the post office onto trains to go across the country. Now, it's been abandoned for the last 25 years or so, and so it's just a bunch of unused space, but it is a massive, massive platform. Remember that this was the busiest post office in the United States, sitting right above our train shed. So the old post office is basically right here. It's no longer a post office, and like I said, the mail platform hasn't been used for mail in a long time. But it's a massive platform. It would give us capacity for as many as 6 more trains at a time if we activate it. The other cool thing about this platform, unlike all the other platforms in the station, it's a high-level platform. All the other platforms in the station are low-level platforms, which means you have to walk up steps to get up to the floor level of the train, which also means from an ADA perspective, we have to have lifts and everything else to get folks up onto the trains. But this is already at level, floor level with the trains. So all of our corridor services or state-supported services, basically all your trains that you have coming from Michigan here, for example, would be able to, now the current fleet would be able to use this platform. So we'd be making a major step in ADA accessibility. Obviously a major step in long-term capacity at the station, but also this project has to come before all of these other projects. Because in order to do these projects, we have to take tracks out of service. We have to take platforms out of service. And there's no way we have the capacity to do that until we do this project. So this one is the one that's moving the fastest right now. And these are just some photos out on the platform. It's actually pretty cool if you're into sort of urban exploring and that sort of thing. There's tons of old rusty mail equipment and conveyor belts, and we have seemingly miles of basement underneath that and so forth. It's kind of interesting and it's kind of cool, but you just make sure your tetanus shots are up to date before you walk out there. So where are we at right now in all of this? Well, that phase 1A study, kind of the next phase of the master plan, is complete. So we have, for those projects I showed you, basically anywhere from 15 to 30% design on those projects. I mentioned that we didn't have any ADA access yet on the head house side, and so one of the projects was installing an elevator or two over there. Well, one of those elevators is currently funded and under construction and will be opened hopefully by the end of September. The mail platform, like I said, that is priority number one out in the train shed, at least on that side of things. And so that's something that we have now gone into further study on that to make sure we fully understand our long-term vision. Again, it's very complicated. It's also underneath a bunch of other buildings, and how we get people out there and what we do with them once we get them out there will change a little bit how we think about our operations at Union Station. The other thing is it does, getting back to that stub end thing that I was talking about before, is on either side of that platform, actually, we have the only through tracks at Union Station, kind of wedged between the concourse and the river. So with this platform activated, you could theoretically operate through service through Chicago. So you could have a train from, say, Pontiac to Milwaukee, a single seat ride between those two cities. So that one's moving forward. And then, like anything else, the other projects will proceed to 100% design as the funds are available. Now, we have a couple of different funding sources. Of course, we look at our own agency funds, the commuter rail funds, funds from the city and so forth, federal sources as always. But then there's also something else, and this is kind of the second part of my presentation, is the master development, something we call the master development. Okay, and this is really part of a broader initiative at Amtrak to leverage something that we haven't been really good at since we were created as an agency in the 70s, and that's leveraging all the real estate assets that Amtrak actually owns across the country, particularly the major stations, and really turning them into crown jewels of their neighborhoods, into true transit-oriented development, making them a better place for our customers, making them a draw for the neighborhood, making them revenue generators, and really creating even more demand for service on Amtrak. So for example, my station, Chicago Union Station, right here, this building is where the Great Hall is at, if you've been in the station. There's 8 floors of office space on top of that building that have been basically vacant for decades. Around the base, tons of retail, prime retail, vacant, most of it, for decades. So there's a lot of space that has not been used. And so we're going into these public-private partnerships with developers to help develop these real estate assets. And so what that allows us to do is all of the things that I talked about, making a better place, a better station, but also the funds from that public-private partnership help us to fund those infrastructure projects that I was talking about in the first part of my presentation. So there's basically 3 parcels that are being developed by this master developer that we're working with right now, that we're in negotiation with. The first one is the head house itself. That's parcel number 1. North is to the bottom. This is the Chicago River right here. And so they're going to rejuvenate that space, use all of that unused space within the station. There's sort of a second part of that, which is also sort of historically interesting. When this building was designed in 1925, it was designed to be not an 8-story building, but more like a 30-story building. That was the original intent. That intent was never realized, but the foundations and the columns can support a much taller building. So the second phase of developing the head house is to add more floors on top of it and add more density to the sort of transit-oriented environment here. That would include residential and hotel. And then the second parcel there to the south of the station is currently an Amtrak parking garage. That is slated to be developed into office towers. And then the third parcel is the last remaining bit of air rights above our tracks. And that would be residential or office. And that would also be a place where if we have access down to the tracks, because we widen the platforms, we would sort of carve out an additional head house of sorts on the first floor of that development to allow nice access down to platform level. And that concludes my presentation. Any questions?